not easy being a Greek in the diaspora, because you have that Greek blood in you, and you feel Greek, because the first words you ever heard when you were born were Greek words. And you spoke nothing but Greek until you were 5, 6 years old, until you went to school. But my Greek is not the best. We call it spasmena. So when I go to Greece and I go to the airports, or people talk to me, they look down their nose at me because I talk with Gringlish, you know, like instead of saying astidia, I say tiketa. We take the American word ticket and we make it into Greek, tiketa, you know, like the roof is roofy, you know. So I'm not accepted by the Americans as being truly American, because I go to Greek church and celebrate our Independence Day, march in the street with our kids dressed in fustanelas and so forth, you know, so the Americans kind of look down at us. But at the same time, we're not accepted by the Greeks either. We're Americans, you know, we got lots of money and blah, 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 you know.
There are instances that are documented of Greeks coming to what is now the United States as far back as the 16th century. Just occasional instances of Greek sailors traveling with early explorers, for example. But really, the most significant early Greek immigration was in the early part of the 19th century. During the Greek War of Independence, there was a great deal of sympathetic and enthusiastic support for the Greek cause. Several dozen Greek orphans were brought over and were provided excellent schooling and support, and a number of these people became prominent in various fields. Michael Anagnos was instrumental in starting one of the earliest schools for the blind in the 1850s and 60s. The number of Greek merchants established themselves in such cities as New Orleans and New York. The first large wave really began in the 1880s, where there were several thousand Greeks who came primarily from the area around Sparta. In the 1890s, it reached 10,000, 15,000 who came primarily from Arcadia. That immigration was triggered to a significant extent by an enormous drop in the price of raisins, because that is a major export crop. Immigrants from Crete were important among the miners and the railroad workers in the West. Then there was another large group who went up into New England to work in the textile industry and the shoe industry. Many came to this country as single men, believing that they would only stay for a relatively short time. But most of them did not go back.
My father had 5 brothers. There were 6 brothers all told. And the oldest brother was George. And they were naftis, they were sailors. They came from Neapoli, and their father was a fisherman, and so the sea was their life. And they consisted of the entire crew of this little freight ship. George got sick and died at sea, and the captain wanted to bury him at sea. And the 5 remaining brothers insisted that he be buried in a church with a priest. And the captain says, "I'm a priest on this boat." Says, "No, you're not." And one of the brothers pulled out this old rusty pistol and took over the ship. They brought the ship to the nearest port, which was the Canary Islands. And they took George to a Greek Orthodox church, and he was buried in the graveyard there. They headed for Boston. When they pulled into the port, they had the captain locked up downstairs. They jumped ship, pooled all their money together, took a taxi, and went up to Saco, Maine. They had an uncle that lived there, Theo Mendy. In fact, he's my godfather, Theo Mendy. And Theomendi listened to their tale of woe and told them, no way can you go back to Greece because you'll be accused of mutiny. You can stay here in America, but you don't have any money. So the best thing is for one of you to get married. And when you get married, you will have the prika, which everybody who's Greek knows what that is. And then you'll be able to survive. And this way you'll get a job in the factory here. That's how my father picked my mother as a wife, much to her dismay at the beginning. And that's how I was born in Saco, Maine.
There was a tendency to be prejudiced against the Greeks who were coming as immigrants. Now, it wasn't just the Greeks. It was the Italians, it was Armenians, it was Poles, and so on. Greeks at that time actually suffered some very vicious attacks, particularly in the West, in mining and railroad communities in Utah and in Nebraska. In Omaha in 1909, a Greek immigrant killed a drunken policeman. He argued it was in self-defense, and the established community launched an attack and burned down the whole Greek section of town. However, between 1900 and 1920, there were close to 400,000 Greeks who came. We're counting there not just Greeks from the Greek nation, but we're also including refugees in the early 1920s from Anatolia, people who had been displaced after the Greek defeat in the Greco-Turkish War.
My first name is really Thumia, and they changed it into Sano, and it remained Sano. I born in Turkey, way above Ankara. I don't know the town. The only thing I remember is Ayandon. The one I born in was 30 families. I born 1910, May 10, 1910, Kamsa. My grandfather's name was Varidime. My father's name was Lambo. We had a land and we had our own home, our own cows. I had very happy childhood. My parents were good people. The neighbors were good people. You know, we was a family. The whole town was a family. Ayandon was all Greeks. There were no Turks among us. Of course, Turks once in a while, they come. My grandparents was blacksmith. They come to have their tools fixed. Room, they call us, room.
Έχω γεννηθεί το 1908 στην Αμισό, εκεί που είναι η Μαύρη Θάλασσα. Είχαμε πολύ ωραίο σπίτι, ανοιχτό σπίτι. Ποτέ κόσμος δεν έλειπε, καλός κόσμος. Είχα καλή οικογένεια. Είχαμε ωραίες εκκλησίες, είχαμε την Αγία Τριάδα στη μέση και από ένα μέρος ήταν το νηπιαγωγείο των παιδιών και από το άλλο τα κορίτσια. Όλα τα αδέλφια μου ήσαν πεπαιδευμένοι. Ήταν ωραία η Τουρκία τότε. Μιλώ τουρκικά. Της μητέρας μου η γλώσσα. Ne yapıyorsun? Τι κάνετε? Ο πατέρας μου είχε καφενείο, αλλά ήταν το καφενείο του διαφορετικό. Δεν ήταν να κάνουν κέμπελ και τέτοια. Τους είπε, έχω το καφενείο αυτό, αλλά θέλω να παίξετε και άμα χάσετε να πάρετε από ένα κόφι. Έχασα τον πατέρα μου 11 χρονών. Οι Τούρκοι είχαν εξορίσει όλους τους άντρες και δεν τον είδα ύστερα.
People was coming to the town. All of a sudden, they robbed people. I could remember a girl, she had a hope chest. Years ago, they used to make a hope chest. You know, what they're going to talk to their, when they get married. And they took it, and the town got up with the rifles, and they chased them. After that, the Turks took all the men away, took them wherever they took them. My father came back, all his feet was cut. We had to hide him from the neighbors so they won't squeal on him and come and get him. Right after that, they came and took us all out, and my father was with us, pushed us, going on a road, and you walk every day. Sometimes we slept in, sometimes we slept out with a little tent they make just to cover the top, and we slept all of us under one cover. My sister died on the road. The twins, one of them died. Then the other one died. We went beyond Diyarbakir. One day my father said, we have to go back. We can't keep going and going. Where are we going? Through the night, we ran back in this little town. And this little town was all broken down, houses was there. And we got in a room, in a place about as big as a closet, and we slept in there. And my little sister, Nastasia, she wanted to go to the bathroom. I took her to the bathroom. A little later, she wanted to go again, and I took her. And that night, she started to making some kind of gargling noise. And I said to my mother, I said, why she's making this noise? And she replied, she's dying. And she died that night. The next day, we went in this little town if you call it, 5 families. It's just like nowhere. This woman said to my mother, says, why don't you leave her with us, meaning me, leave her with them. And my mother said, no, she said, she's not my child. I can't give it, leave her here. But we talking, and she said, come on, leave her with us, we'll take good care of her. So finally my mother, she gave me a hug and, kissed me, and she said, you stay, I'll come and get you. I'll come and see you. She never did. She never did.
Η αλήθεια του Θεού δεν έχω με τους Τούρκους θυμό και κακό. Αφού ο Τούρκος εμένα και τη μητέρα μου έσωσε. Είπε έλα να σας στείλω με το πρώτο πλοίο που φεύγουνε γιατί θα γίνει χάλια εδώ. Και ύστερα από εκείνο δεν είδα. Έμαθα, έγιναν πολλά δυστυχήματα. Ήμουνα τυχερή που είχα σωθεί. Πήγαμε στον αδελφό μου στη Θεσσαλονίκη. Εκεί ήταν στρατιώτης.
Ruth, the woman I lived with, changed my first name from Thimia to Sano, even so that I didn't want Sano, I wanted Thimia. And I learned to accept it as time passed. I lived with them for, I think, a couple of years. She didn't hit me, she never lifted her hand on me, but she was very abusive with the mouth. And I couldn't take that. I didn't like nobody curse at my family. It was a hole in the ceiling. It's, they don't have no windows or anything. The whole house is without windows. So she said to me, you see that hole up there? She said, I'm going to put rope up there and hang you. And I got out. I went, I crossed the little lake and I'm going, and all of a sudden I hear her voice yelling, Sano, come back. Never looked back. I kept running and crying and running. I went into Diyarbakir. I got into Marketplace. Well, Marketplace is big, everybody sells things outside. I'm walking back and forth, and it's getting dark. It's getting very dark. The Finally, this woman out of clear sky, she was in front of me. And that's God's the truth. She was in front of me, and I said, hello, and she said, who are you? And I told her who I was. And she took me home. She took me home. I slept there. Next day morning, they gave me a few pennies and locked the door and put me out. Like you put a cat out, not a human, but I put me out. And I was very, very sick. I was so sick. I had a headache, I was shivering, and no place but God's warm place, you know, where the sun shines. The neighbor saw me, and she said, why don't you come and live with me? She said, I have one little girl, and I'm going to have another baby. Why don't you come and live with us? Well, who am I to say no? And they were Armenian people. They're very nice people, and I lived with them. Well, we was there, I think, not quite a year. Turks don't want the family, has to get out. You know, if they change their name, maybe they could stay, be a Turk, can be Armenian, you know. So we came to Aleppo, Syria.
Το 1928 παντρεύτηκα και ήρθαμε στην Αμερική. Αυτός ήξερε την οικογένεια της αδελφής μου. Εδώ ήταν η αδελφή μου και ρώτησε αν έχει αδελφή. Και είπανε ναι, έχω, λέει, αδελφή. Καλά, λέει, γιατί την κρύβεις? Δεν την κρύβω, στην Ελλάδα. Πες να, λέει, έρχομαι να την πάρω.
His name was Abraham. He was a Syrian. We never held hands. We never sat next to each other. We never knew anything about each other. We knew each other 10 days, and we got married. Then we went to Beirut, Syria. One day he said to me, Sano, if I leave you behind, you will know how to come to America? I said, no. And I won't know nothing about it. So he stayed with me, brought me to America. The trip was very nice. I could remember, and I see this fish flying in the air, and I never knew fish flies in the air, you know. We was eating one time spaghetti. Well, the spaghetti was so white, it looked like worms. And I said to my husband, I can't eat that stuff, you know, it's terrible.
When they came into the harbor, the boat would dock either in New York City or Jersey City or Hoboken, one of the cities around the harbor. The first and second class passengers were allowed to undergo their inspection on board the boat. The third class passengers, which was by far the largest number of people, were put onto a ferry boat which brought them to Ellis Island for inspection. For everybody coming in, there was a great anxiety because it was unknown. Everybody knew somebody who had been rejected. Rumors circulated about reasons why people would be rejected. When they landed, each person was given a landing card, a piece of cardboard, with their name written by the ship's officer, but the biggest thing on the card was a number, which represented the line that their name was on the passenger list. They had to climb a stairway from the first floor to the second floor where the inspection was to take place. At the top of the stairway was a group of doctors who were trying to judge in the space of a relatively few seconds whether the immigrants that they saw had any particular health problems that required further investigation. There were certain diseases, like an eye disease called trachoma, which at that time was incurable, could lead to blindness, and was very contagious. Anybody who had trachoma would be returned.
We stopped in there, and he says, "Why do you get those marks on your legs?" I said, "When I was a little girl, I was on an outside, and all of a sudden I couldn't walk. Something stung me or whatever it was, and my leg blew up."
If an immigrant were ill with some ordinary illness, let's say they had the flu or appendicitis, they would be treated at a hospital here on the south side of Ellis Island. And they could stay for a week, some of them stayed for a month while they were being treated. One might be rejected for political reasons. They would not accept anarchists. After the Russian Revolution, communists were excluded. Single women with no relatives were inspected very closely because of the concern that they might end up, for example, being prostitutes. At this point, the American government was anxious to have most immigrants come to this country. They were being sought as valuable members of the labor force. No more than 2 to 4% of the immigrants were rejected.
After they looked at my leg, and they asked questions, I couldn't answer. Pop answered, my husband, and I had to put my finger to make my name. And as soon as we finished, Pop says, "Come on," he said, "let's go, son. Come on, let's get away from here before they find something wrong." And we went across the river. The only thing that got me to New York, the big, tall buildings and children skating. They're skating like crazy, shaking their arms. And I said, how in the heaven's name they stay on those things?
Όταν ήρθα εδώ, πολύ την αγάπησα. Την άρεσα τόσο πολύ. Λέω, thank God, είναι ωραίο μέρος. Και επειδή είχα και δική μου οικογένεια, πιο πολύ με έδωσε ζέστη. But οι Έλληνες δεν ήσανε τόσο ζεστοί. Άμα ακούγανε από την Τουρκία ήμουνα, σε βλέπανε και είπα κι εγώ, εμείς είμαστε πιο χριστιανοί από εσάς, τους είπα. Με πείραξε,
My father went up to Newark, New Jersey, where he had a cousin who had a restaurant there. And his brother, Stathi, came with him. All the Greeks lived in one area called the West Market Street. We spoke nothing but Greek. All the women and men that lived there were my Theo and Thea, the Bukovalis family, and the Trefalis family, and the Koronakis, We were all like brothers and sisters, and at night we'd all sit around the kitchen stove because the housing then were cold water flats and tenement houses, and Papa would tell his great stories of the Greek myths. My mother brought me to school, and I couldn't understand a word of English. I heard the teacher talking and sounded Japanese or some other language. And my mother told me, "Να καθίσεις εδώ και να μην πεις κουβέντα. Καταλαβαίνεις, δεν να μας ντροπιάσεις." And that's the one the Greeks never wanted was to become embarrassed. So I sat there and the teacher came over. First time I ever saw a woman with lipstick and eyebrow pencil, everything. Didn't say anything. And she told me, "We're going to be good friends, Johnny." I couldn't understand what she was saying. And I just sat there and she gave me some blocks to play with. And then I had to go to the bathroom. I started to squirm, raised my hand. "Yes, Johnny." "Πρέπει να πάω στο μέρος." "Oh, isn't that nice? He's talking Greek." "Children, come over and hear Johnny Callis talk Greek." It got worse. "Πρέπει να πάω στο μέρος." "Can anyone understand him?" And a little black boy raised his hand. He says, "You don't have to know Greek. That boy have to go to the bathroom." And that's how I made my first American friend, Leroy Johnson. He became good friends with him.
In cities particularly like New York and Chicago, and then to a lesser extent Baltimore and Philadelphia. These cities held the largest number of Greeks outside of Greece, really. Many of the Greeks engaged in small businesses of various kinds: shoe shining, florists, candy shops, small restaurants, and they would employ other Greeks. Now, the working conditions were often very, very poor, and there's no question that oftentimes the Greek owners, for instance, of some of these small businesses exploited their countrymen.
Unfortunately, it was very, very difficult for Greeks to find work. All the good jobs were taken by the Irish. Couldn't get a job driving a bus or working on the subway. The insurance companies never hired any Greeks. So they were forced to go to work in the restaurants. And my father spent his whole life working in restaurants. He started as a dishwasher like everyone else, slowly became a short order cook, and then eventually became a very good chef. But every morning he'd get up 6 o'clock in the morning, go to work, get home at 6, and we kids would rub his feet because they were always sore. The important thing was that we get good grades as far as our parents were concerned. They insisted that we bring home good report cards.
Even in the old country, there was more of a tradition of the value of education than there was in other peasant societies. This positive attitude carried over in the United States.
I used to love to turn pages on, used to bring a whole lot of books. And I go through the books page by page. I just love to go through them. I don't know why. And I learned how to, with the kids and all that, I learned the language, and I learned to read a little bit. I learned to do all my work. I done it myself. I had 10 children. 10 children. I had when I was 15. I had 18. I had 20. I had 22, 24. After that, it's a little bit more far apart.
There was a tendency where the opportunity existed for Greeks to want to be self-employed. My own opinion is that it has to do with the fact that in rural Greece, many of the villagers did own a small plot of land, pressed olive oil, they grew grapes, they had a product which they sold, and they had market economy experience, which made them less willing to work for other people if they had the opportunity to start their own business. It's certainly true that a higher proportion of people of Greek descent became white-collar workers, professionals, businessmen than many other ethnic groups, and certainly a higher proportion than the American population at large.
Κάποιο factory ανοίξανε για να κάνουν κάτι σίδερα για πόλεμο. Μικρά έτσι στρογγυλά για να το βάλουν στο χώμα, και όταν ο κακούργος θα έρθει να πέσει και να πεθάνει. Πήγα εκεί και τα αγγλικά δεν τα ήξερα καλά. Ο άνθρωπος με ρωτάει, ο διευθυντής, πού εργάστηκες? Λέω, δεν εργάστηκα πουθενά. Είμαι, λέω, housewife. Πάτε, λέω, μπορώ να μάθω όλα, να τα κάνω. Μάντε η δουλειά έχεις, είπε. Και εργάστηκα εκεί 3 μήνες. Αλλά ένα πράγμα παρατηρώ, είναι αμαρτία τώρα που θα το πω. Παίζανε, αντί να δουλέψουνε τα κορίτσια, παιχνίδια κάνανε, εμένα επειδή δούλευα μόνανε. Μια μέρα πια δεν μπόρεσα, λέω, άκου εδώ ήρθα για να εργαστώ. Όταν είδε ο άνδρας μου ότι εργάζομαι, λέει, θα πάρω το ανθοπολείο και έλα μέσα. Και πήγα μαζί του στο South Hastrin, Arkansas.
When the war broke out, I was 19 years old. I joined the paratroopers. I jumped in Normandy. I remember coming down in a parachute, and all I could say was Panaya, Panaya. We were one of the first soldiers to break into Dachau and first soldiers to see the furnaces and what they did to the Jewish people there. It was quite an experience, and it has affected my whole life since then. I'm totally against war. When the Germans broke through in the Battle of the Bulge, I was missing in action. I got separated from my group. All my patrol was killed. And my younger brother, Constantine, who we all loved, he was a little bow-legged kid when he was small. He was wounded in the first day he went into combat in France and wound up in England in the hospital for almost a year. And my other brother, Babe, also was in the army. So my father had his 3 sons. All 3 were in the army. Devastated him. He would get letters from me, but they would be big holes would be cut into them because they were all censored. He would get up in the middle of the night, couldn't sleep, and he'd walk out, just walk in the streets, and he'd meet the other Greek men walking in the streets. And he wanted to get into the army so he could find me, be with me. Beside that, my father didn't know how his mother and father were still alive. You know, there was famine in Greece, and the Greeks that were here could not communicate with their parents and their relatives in Greece, and it was terrible. It was our Holocaust. When we started to get letters, I remember my father sitting in bed and crying like a little baby because he found that both his mother and father had died. And then my mother's father and mother had died. You know, and this is news we got long after they died, when the war was over.
Ο πατέρας μου με τον πόλεμο ήταν στην Κεφαλονιά γραμματικός της κοινότητας, αλλά επειδή είχε φιλελεύθερες ιδέες, οι οποίες συγκρούονταν με τις ιδέες γεμάτες ταμπού και παροπίδες των χωριανών, και γι' αυτόν τον λόγο τον κατάτρεχαν ως αριστερό. Τον έβγαλαν και τον έκαναν εξορία από την Κεφαλονιά το 1947, δεν κάνω λάθος. Και μετά που ήρθε πίσω στην Κεφαλονιά, επειδή ήταν αντιθέτων φρονημάτων, δεν ήταν, η ιδεολογία του ήταν φιλελεύθερη, δεν την μπορούσε να βρει δουλειά με κανέναν τρόπο. Λοιπόν, η μόνη λύση ήταν να βγούμε τα παιδιά στο εξωτερικό. Συνήθως δεν τα ρωτάγανε τα παιδιά, θες να φύγεις, δεν θέλεις. Απλώς σας βρίσκαν μια δουλειά σε ένα βαπόρ και σε πάνε αμέσως, λέει φύγε. Να φύγεις, να κατακτήσεις την Αμερική μόνο με γράμματα της τρίτης του γυμνασίου ή του δημοτικού, με τα γυμνά σου μπράτσα, για να βγάλεις μεροκάματο, να ζήσεις τον εαυτό σου και να μείνεις και με τα χαρτιά σου εντάξει. Πώς θα τα καταφέρεις τα πράγματα, χωρίς να είσαι προετοιμασμένος. Μπήκα στα βαπόρια και στην Αμερική βγήκα έξω να πιάσω και εγώ το αμερικανικό όνειρο, και εδώ στη Νέα Υόρκη είχα ένα θείο αδερφό του πατέρα μου, πήγα εκεί πέρα σπίτι, βρήκα μια δουλειά στα πιάτα, με ένα μεροκάματο το οποίο σου έφτανε ίσα να ζεις. Το αμερικανικό καταστημένο στις αρχές της δεκαετίας του 50 ήταν πολύ ξενοφοβικό. Ποιος ήταν ξένος, ήταν και κομμουνιστής. Ήταν τότε ο μακαρτισμός. Με αυτή την φόρα πιάσανε και εμένα, ναι. Ο οποίος δεν είχα κλείσει 17 χρόνια ακόμα, 16 ετών, δεν είχα ιδέα τι πάει να πει ζωή και πείρα ζωής. Όταν με πιάσανε, ρώτησα μερικούς. Τον μπόση μου που δούλευα, τον αφεντικό μου που δούλευα από την Αβιά, του λέω τι να πω στο μικρέ στην αστυνομία, μου λέει πες την αλήθεια. Και οι Αμερικάνοι είναι καλοί άνθρωποι, θα σε καταλάβουν. Πήγανε μέσα, με ρωτήσανε για ποιο λόγο ήρθες στην Αμερική. Και τους είπα ότι ήρθα για να δουλέψω, για να βοηθήσω την οικογένειά μου. Και μου λένε, δηλαδή, σου αρέσει η Αμερική? Λέω, ναι, μου αρέσει. Αυτό ήταν και η καταδίκη μου. Δεν μου επέτρεψε να βάλω εγγύηση $500 το γύρο εκείνο, που δεν τα είχα, θα τα έβανε ο μπάρμπας μου, να βγω έξω και να βρω βαπόρι να φύγω. Οι άλλοι, οι πιο έξυπνοι από μένα, οι οποίοι είχαν πείρα της ζωής, λέγανε όταν τους έπιανε η αστυνομία ότι ξέρετε, εγώ την Αμερική δεν μου αρέσει, ούτε θέλω να μείνω. Απλούστατα εμέθησα στο βαπόρι μου και το έχασα και θα φύγω πάλι με το βαπόρι. Εμένα, επειδή είπα αυτό το πράγμα, με βάλανε φυλακή μέσα και κάθισα 4 μήνες από 3 του Νοέμβρη του 1951 έως 28 του Φλεβάρι του 1952. Χειμώνας και εορτές. Τα Χριστούγεννα και τον Άγιο Βασίλη, είμαστε φυλακή μέσα. Αυτό ήταν η αίθουσα που περνάγαμε την ημέρα μας. Δηλαδή ερχόμαστε 7 η ώρα το πρωί μέχρι 7 η ώρα το βράδυ, πριν μας κλείσουν στα δωμάτια των κρατωμένων στο δεύτερο πάτωμα. Εδώ γύρω-γύρω τα παράθυρα είχαν κάγκελα, δεν είναι όπως είναι τώρα ακριβώς. Η μεσαία πόρτα που έβγαινε στην αυλή και ήταν γύρω-γύρω περιφραγμένη η αυλή με σειρματόπλεγμα και σκοπιά από πάνω. Και στο αριστερό μέρος ήταν μια σκάλα που πηγαίναμε στα υπνοδωμάτια. Μια σκάλα σιδερένια, παλαιά, σκουριασμένη. Πήγαινα και έβλεπα απέναντι από τα παράθυρα που ήταν οι ουρανοξύστες της Νέας Υόρκης και φανταζόμουν την τύχη τη δική μου, κλεισμένος εδώ πέρα, να ονειρεύουμε και την τύχη των αυτών το οποίο ήταν έξω από τη φυλακή. Δηλαδή αισθανόμουν σαν ένα πουλί σε κλουβί το οποίο το έχουν αφαιρέσει όλα του τα δικαιώματα, το έχουν αφαιρέσει το δικαίωμα να ονειρεύεται. Εν τω μεταξύ κάποιος χωριανός δικός μας εδώ στην Αμερική είχε κάνει ένα βαποράκι μικρό στην αρχή, το Ένος, και αυτός υποσχέθηκε τον πατέρα μου και τον παρμό ότι θα με βοηθούσε να με έπαιρνε στο βαπόρι μέσα. Ήρθε ένας φρουρός και φώναξε να πάμε, μου λέει Γαβρίτ, ήταν στο γραφείο. Πήγα στο γραφείο, μου λένε ξέρεις, μια ευκαιρία για εσένα να φύγεις. Και υπόγραψε κάτι χαρτιά και θα φύγεις, μου λέει. Ο φρουρός περίμενε από πίσω, μου λέει πάμε πίσω να πάρεις τα πράγματά σου, μου λέει, που γίνει στο γραφείο. Εφοβήθηκα τόσο πολύ να πω μέσα πάλι, λέω δεν έχω τίποτα, δεν θέλω τίποτα. Μου λέει δεν έχω τίποτα, απολύτως. Τίποτα. Και απαράτησα, είχα ένα σακίδιο με κάτι ρούχα να αλλάξω, κάτι γράμματα από την πατρίδα. Συνέχισα τη ζωή του ναυτικού για περίπου 12 χρόνια. Η Αμερική την είχα πλέον ως ένα κράτος το οποίο ήταν έξω από τις προοπτικές μου. Κάναμε ταξίδια σε διάφορα λιμάνια τακτικά, δηλαδή κάθε 15 μέρες μέσα στο ίδιο λιμάνι, στη Γουατεμάλα. Εκεί γνώρισα με μια κοπέλα, την αγάπησα και παντρεύτηκα εκεί πέρα. Πήγα να βρω εργασία ως ξένος. Υπάρχει ο νόμος εκεί πέρα, 15% μόνο των ξένων επιτρέπεται να δουλεύουν σε εργοστάσια. Και ζήτησα και έγινα Γουατεμαλτέκος υπήκοος. Έβγανα διαβατήριο Γουατεμάλας. Αγόρασα 3 ταξιά, μιλούσα αγγλέζικα, ελληνικά, πήγαινα με τις τουρίστες και δούλευα. Πήγα αρκετά καλά, πήρα σπίτι δικό μου όλα. Στα βαπόρια που ήμουν είχα γνωρίσει μία δικηγορίνα. Ήταν φίλη του εφοπλιστή. Με ειδοποίησαν ότι αν θέλω να έρθω στην Αμερική ως μετανάστης θα μου βρίσκανε δουλειά. Ήταν το 1969. Εγώ για τον εαυτό μου στην Γουατεμάλα ήμουν καλά και τη γυναίκα μου. Τα παιδιά μου είχαν 3 κορίτσια. Από απόψεως όμως μόρφωσης, η απόψεως αποκατάσταση ήταν λιγάκι δύσκολο. Και έτσι τα αποφάσισα και γίναμε καινούργιοι μετανάστες στην Αμερική το 1970, μετά από αυτή την πείρα την πίκρη που είχα το 1950. Δουλέψα σκληρά στην αρχή, μέχρι σήμερα, χειρονακτικές εργασίες. Και λυπάμαι τον εαυτό μου που μέχρι σήμερα δεν κατόρθωσα να πηγήσω κανένα σχολείο. Δηλαδή δεν κατόρθωσα να πάω σε ένα πανεπιστήμιο να βγω κάποιος άνθρωπος, διότι δεν μπορούσα. Απλώς δεν είχα καιρό. Έπρεπε να ζήσω.
When the war ended, I was able to go to engineering school. I became an engineer, and then I went on to become a scientist for Bell Telephone Laboratories. And I got my PhD, and they paid for everything. And that's how I was able to work on developing the computers and the silicon chips and so forth. Then I became a professor in teaching. I taught at NYU. And then I also became a filmmaker. At NYU again, I taught with Marty Scorsese films and so forth. So I've been very, very lucky with the education I got. And then I married an actress, and I wrote a play, put it away, and she found it, and she sent it to the actor studio. And they got in touch with me and insisted that I come down and join their playwright lab. And I just fell in love with the theater. So I've been writing plays ever since. Now what I've done, my father made it his business to teach us the Greek myths. Now in respect to my father, I'm doing the same thing. And these plays are being taught in schools all throughout America. My father would say, there isn't anything you cannot do if someone else has already done it. And I know a lot of very, very well-known Greeks, and they've made their mark in America by doing the best they can.
The image of Greeks and Greek Americans today among the general American population is generally positive. Part of this has to do with the fact that very large elements of the Greek community have achieved professional status and economic success. I think this is the result of the drive to succeed economically rather than simply to get along.
Αυτή είναι η ελληνοαμερικάνικη φιλοσοφία. Όσο πιο πολλά χρήματα μαζέψεις, τόσο πιο σε υπολογίζουν. Το οποίο είναι τελείως, κατά τη γνώμη μου, λανθασμένο. Αυτό είναι το αμερικάνικο όνειρο. Εγώ δοκιμάζω να πω στους ανθρώπους ότι το αμερικάνικο όνειρο κάθε ενός μας είναι διαφορετικό. Άλλος θέλει να έρθει εδώ πέρα και να αισθάνεται ελεύθερος να πει τη γνώμη του, να φωνάξει ό,τι θέλει. Άλλος θέλει να ζήσει όπως είναι οι υπόλοιποι. Άλλος θέλει να κάνει χρήματα. Η πίστη μου εμένα και το χόμπι μου είναι να γράφω. Μ' αρέσουν πάρα πολύ τα γράμματα. Τώρα που έγινα συνταξιούχος, εδώ και 5 χρόνια, έχω μάθει κομπιούτερ μόνος μου. Έχω μπει στο ίντερνετ μέσα, γράφω βιβλία και ξαναζώ τη ζωή μου μέσα από τα βιβλία μου. Είναι ένα άλλο εγώ δικό μου, το οποίο αυτό με ικανοποιεί αφάνταστα.
Διάλεξα τη Νέα Υόρκη επειδή ζουν τα αδέρφια μου εδώ. Όταν ήρθα εδώ, ανακάλυψα ότι δεν υπήρχε κανένα ελληνικό βιβλιοπωλείο. Ένα μέρος να μπορεί ένας, όπως εγώ που αγαπώ πάρα πολύ την ελληνική λογοτεχνία, να πηγαίνεις και να βρίσκεις διάφορα βιβλία. Και διαλέξαμε την Αστόρια να κάνουμε αυτή την αρχή. Είναι μια προσπάθεια τώρα που κάνουμε εδώ και 7 χρόνια. Αλλά προσπαθώ ακόμα να βρω Έλληνες που να πιστεύουν στα γράμματά τους. Όχι μόνο να πιστεύουν, αλλά να κάνουν και κάτι για τα γράμματά τους. Πιστεύω ότι αν πηγαίνουμε με το ρυθμό που πηγαίνουμε σήμερα, αυτή την αδιαφορία που εγώ τουλάχιστον έχω διαπιστώσει πάνω στα γράμματα, ότι σε 50 χρόνια τα παιδάκια εδώ πλέον δεν θα μιλάνε ελληνικά. Βλέπω τα νυψάκια μου που πάνε, γίνονται γιατροί τώρα σήμερα εδώ στη Νέα Υόρκη, να μην ξέρουν από πού προέρχονται οι λέξεις όπως ο τωρινολαρυγκολόγος. Λοιπόν, και μου το λένε ότι είναι λατινική λέξη. Καταλαβαίνεις ότι έχουμε πρόβλημα. Είχα την ευκαιρία να σπουδάσω στο Αριστοτέλειο Πανεπιστήμιο Θεσσαλονίκης. Έχω κάνει και αρκετούς φίλους στην Ελλάδα. Έχω βαφτίσει ένα Ελληνόπουλο, έχω παντρέψει ένα Ελληνόπουλο. Οπότε ο δεσμός μου με την Ελλάδα κάθε μέρα μεγαλώνει. Όταν είχαμε πρώτα ανοίξει το μαγαζί, είχαν έρθει κόσμο με πολύ ενθουσιασμό ότι τελικά επιτέλους βρέθηκε ένα μέρος να υπάρχει και να υπάρχει. Και μια μέρα μου ήρθαν 3 κορίτσια από το Columbia University και ψάχνανε. Ξέρεις τι ψάχνανε? Παπαντιαμάνι ψάχνανε. Αλλά δεν ήταν Ελληνόπουλα, ήταν ξένα κορίτσια, ήταν Αμερικανόπουλα. Και ψάχνανε Παπαντιαμάνι στα αγγλικά. Και ήταν η μεγαλύτερη ντροπή που είχα αισθανθεί ποτέ στη ζωή μου, γιατί τους άφησα και φύγανε με άδεια τα χέρια. Οι Έλληνες νομίζουν ότι, τουλάχιστον το διαπιστώνω αυτό, όταν φέρνω αυτό το ζήτημα να κάνουμε περισσότερα, εκείνο που ακούω πάντα είναι «Έλα μωρέ, ποιος ενδιαφέρεται για αυτά τα πράγματα». Αν δεν ενδιαφερθούμε όλοι, είτε Έλληνες ή ξένοι, το ελληνικό πνεύμα σιγά σιγά πεθαίνει στους ανθρώπους. Αυτό τι σημαίνει? Σημαίνει ότι μετά από πολλά χρόνια και κάνουμε μια αναφορά στον Ιπποκράτη, θα λέμε απλώς ο Ιπποκράτης. Δεν θα έχουμε εκείνο το connection πλέον. Το συνδετικό κρίκο θα έχει χαθεί. Δικαιούται η Ελλάδα να έχει ένα Ινστιτούτο, όπου όποιος θέλει να μάθει ελληνικά, όποιος θέλει να βρίσκει ένα βιβλίο, όποιος θέλει να βρίσκει πληροφορία για την Ελλάδα, να είναι το μέρος που θα πάει και θα βρει απάντηση. Δεν υπάρχει ένα τέτοιο μέρος. Και αυτό είναι το void, είναι το κενό που προσπαθούμε να καλύψουμε. και το κάνει ένας Νιγηριάνος, ο οποίος δεν φαίνεται καθόλου Έλληνας.
I would love to be able to have been educated in a Greek college and had the education I had in America, but in Greece instead. And that way I can enjoy the poetry of Cavafy, of all the great poets and so forth. It's a very frustrating thing, this diaspora business, and I'm sure there are millions of Greeks who are born in Australia and in South Africa and America who feel exactly the way I do.
Ολόκληρη ζωή είχα. 52 χρόνια ζήσαμε μαζί. Εργάστηκα μαζί του πολύ καλά, αλλά στο τέλος έπαθε το σρόκ. Όταν αρρώστησε, κατευθείαν από το Άρκανσο ήρθαμε στη Νέα Υόρκη. 18 χρόνια είναι που πέθανε. Και ακόμα σήμερα απ' εκεί τα κορίτσια που μ' αγαπούνε τηλεφωνούνε. Θεία Έλλη, γιατί έφυγες, Αμερικανίδες. Τι έκανες και έφυγες, δεν μας άκουσες. Ήταν μια κυρία και Ελληνίδα πολύ καλή και είδε που είμαι ολομόναχη στο σπίτι. Θέλανε να φέρουν μια γυναίκα και είπε no. Η γυναίκα λέει δεν μπορείς εσύ, καλύτερα έλα να πάω σε ένα μέρο και με έφερε εδώ και είναι πολλά χρόνια.
When my parents died, my mother died about 5 years ago, I feel like I've been abandoned. It's a very difficult thing to explain. Because now all my children are married. I have 7 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. But they all married Americans, and they married Americans again. So now my great-grandchildren are 1/8 Greek only. I'm lucky if I can get them to say Papu. Now I'm 78, I'm ready to die. So?
Since I left my father, I don't speak Greek. But there was something that stayed in my mind, never said in front of my children. I didn't want them to laugh at me, making believe, saying things, So I never did that. But I always thought I mustn't forget. I don't even know if I say it right, but everybody said I said it good, so it must be good, But I never forgot that, no. I never forgot.
Would you like to say it for us?
Huh?
Would you like to say it for us?
You want me to say it?
I don't know if you want.
Yeah, why not? I will. But I have to sit up a little bit. Πάτερ ημών εν της ουρανής, αστεί το θέλημά σου, όσον ουρανών και πεζησίες των άρτων ημών των ομπιούσιων, δώσει μεν σήμερον και αφησιμέν τα αφιλήματα ημών, ως και ημες αφήρμε τις εφολέτες ημών, μη συνέγγες μας πειρασμών, αλλά ρίση μας από το πονίδι. Amen. The Father, the Son, Holy Ghost. Amen. That part I forgot.